First Blacks of Canada Part 3. Gentrification of the Lanteigne country, as seen in the previous two videos and from the phenotypical descriptions of Cartier, Champlain, Verrazano, and countless other early explorers. The first Blacks of Canada were not brought to Canada, but were then, as we remain now, indigenous to Canada, simply put from our Algonquin ancestors through a modern teacher. Numbers of the plant world were burnt, including the trees, and some trees were blackened, from a power that was created by the Creator. So with that blackness, with that char, the Creator took that, with great love and great intention, shifted it into the shell, tapping it down very carefully. Then the Creator took that shell and blew into it, creating the first human being. Terry, Docus, Nipissing, you. This is a Western Algonquin creation story. So the question becomes, how did Canada lose its blackness? How did it lose its char and adopt its colorful mosaic? And the answer is, conquest is no game. Trial and error have no place in the grand stratagem of imperial ambition. Imperial conquest is a rigid arithmetic of atrocious sociopathy, dedicated to the sequestering of capital, and above all land, at the expense of plant, animal, human, and spiritual life. Those who engage in this reckless endeavor aren't ever reckless at all. Instead, they are chaos coordinators. They calculate how to quench every cent out of life itself. They aren't even malicious, just cold, callous collectors, solely concerned with the numbers. This is how the enterprise of immoral, inexcusable infamy called enslavement is allowed. Make no mistakes about it, it is and has been for eons a studied and rehearsed theater of affairs. By the time the Euro-Americans were orchestrating their corporate takeover of the Tamarican Confederation of North America, conquest had been practiced so many times before by European imperialists within Europe that they had it down to a science. Add a bit of confusion, plus a smidge of financial despair. Throw in a dash of military violence at key points, and you have the overthrow of a peaceful social equilibrium that has persisted for eons. It isn't enough to just invade a people. To truly conquer, you must be able to anchor your population into the fabric of their society and remain. Then, to prevent being ejected again, the invading force must uproot enough of the original stock to grow its own roots, but not so much as to erode the foundations itself. The following are samples of this in action. These three histories are perfect examples of the mayhem manipulators working to make Canada a lighter place by extraditing the dark-skinned indigenous, breeding them out of existence, and finally killing them legally in cold blood for profit. The Nug migration to Louisiana, the Great Expulsion 1755 AD. While technically true, the popularized version of the Great Expulsion story is a lie of omission. It leaves out many critically crucial points. Let's start by clarifying exactly where we are talking about. Lanteigne constitutes the eastern maritime provinces of Canada, including the Gaspé and Anticosti Island, but excluding Newfoundland. The French believed Lanteigne was like the place where the first Greeks had come from, which they had called Arcadia. This is phonetically very similar to the Louisette suffix for fertile land. Thus, the French called our province of Lanteigne Acadia. When French Europeans began what we are taught to think of as their mass immigration to Lanteigne, it failed in one regard. The word mass doesn't apply. Though well documented, this lack of a substantial population illuminates the fact that from neither the Lanug nor the French perspective was the French presence considered an invasion. It was thought of as an alliance, a partnership, and yes, even the early stages of a hopeful confederation, rather than an invasion. This is from where the very specific borders of New France were derived. It is also why large numbers of colonists were not needed in the territory. Now, here's where we get critical. Though exact numbers are no longer possible due to several partially destroyed manifests, we are certain that the total number of French immigrants into the entirety of Tamari, which they were calling New France, was no more than 3,000 and no less than 2. These were the only ethnically French citizens in all of the Americas at the time. Moreover, in Lanteigne, Acadia province, we can only account for 615 ethnically French citizens disembarking in the province in the 38-year period between 1604 and 1642, with a maximum possibility of 2115 people. Now, it was a very peculiar but popular European superstition that thought of women being bad luck at sea. This fact saw to it that it was rare for women to make it to the province at all. And now I know some of you history buffs are thinking, But what about the Filles du Roi, or the King's Daughters? Well, there were only a total of 768 of them sent to relieve the men of Quebec City, specifically on June 22, 1663. And none of these were sent to Lenum-TG, Acadia province. While alternatively, the most popular estimates of Lenum-TGE, which are clearly wrong and internally conflictual, typically settle out on an average range for the Lenug population, anywhere from 35,000 to 38,000 individuals. We can be certain this is a low-balled estimate, as the vast majority of Lenug municipalities were neither known to the Europeans, nor could they even begin to factor in all the alterations the European presence had on the local population. But just to strongman the accepted position, we'll use their lowest estimate of 35,000. Therefore, if at best only 2115 ethnically French citizens ever potentially made it to the province, how then in only 71 years did the population go up by a factor of 7, from an original population composing only 6% French men of the total population? These population conflicts are of course compounded by both the wars fought against the Haudenosaunee and also against the British. So what's the official answer? Well, that only complicates things more. The official answer is that natural growth made the 11,000-man expulsion to Louisiana possible. But wait, natural growth? Natural growth with whom? What kind of natural growth could produce French men without French women? Alors nos garçons se marieront à vos filles, nous ne ferons plus qu'un seul peuple. Urson will marry your daughters, and we will become one people. Miscegenation. Miscegenation is the technical term for race mixing, while the strategy cooked up by the Spanish using race mixing to replace the leadership of an enemy nation. Literally, sleeping your way to the top and conquering through coitus is called blanqueamiento. When the French adopted and applied this tactic deliberately, they called it blanquiment. This was the birth of two new nations from the infiltration of the once single indigenous Moog Nation. It created both French loyal Acadians and mixed loyalty Mi'kmaq, all united in their hatred towards the British, whom they all collectively fought. And yet, at the same time, all were painted with the same label of Acadians, even though the vast majority of their collective blood quantum was objectively ethnically La Noog. In other words, little to none of the so-called Acadians had any ethnically French blood whatsoever. These people, thought of as pure French citizens, were either, after the first generation, only minutely ethnically French, or in fact entirely ethnically Lenug, merely living under the French label of Acadian because of the nature of their government's alliance. It is in fact very common to read of the composition of Lug Franco armies, consisting of 300 men, only having 10 or less ethnically French soldiers. Now, living under British occupation after what must have seemed to be the near end of the war to restore the great city of Kaipuktuk, an address was called. On Friday, September 5th, 1755, Colonel Winslow ordered all males 10 years and up in the area to gather in the Grand Pré Church for an important message. Then they began the uprooting. A decree was read stating, "Your land and tenements, cattle of all kinds and livestock of all sorts are forfeited to the crown, with all of your other effects save your money and household goods, and you yourselves are to be removed from this province." The British feared an indigenous reclamation of their Lenug lands and aimed to flood the region with British loyalists, which would reward them for not capitulating to the rumblings of an American Revolution in the South. The Great Expulsion had begun. By August 18th of 1762, some 7 years later, the last 1,300 of the 11,000, predominantly Lenug Acadians, which consisted of at least 8,000 more so-called indigenous Acadians than the nearly 3,000 total ethnic Frenchmen than had ever even been transported into New France, were set to be deposited into Boston. However, upon arrival in Boston, the 5 ships carrying the last scheduled 1,300 Acadians was denied at port. Apparently, the predominantly ethnically Lenug Acadians were more trouble than they were worth throughout all the cities that they had been assigned to. And there was also a discrepancy in the number having said to have been sent, and the number received by the Boston. Halifax claimed to have sent only 915, while Boston received a full 385 more than they were willing to handle. As we learned from our episode on Deer Island, this type of thing was a common occurrence in this period. This constant dumping of ethnic Nug in the Bostonian port had to stop. Thus, the ship returned to the port of Halifax. Upon return, all were declared prisoners of war and made to work their own previously owned lands. This insistence on quenching resistance would persist until in 1778 the last of the resistance was rounded up and sent to France and the Caribbean. Though none were directly sent to Louisiana, nearly all would find their eventual home there for a variety of reasons.
Who were marooned in Jamaica and the Watertown Treaty. On July 19, 1776, the multilingual Sacmao Denaquara stared down at a document which a stranger with the face of his enemies had slid across the table before him. Should he trust him? You see, his people, the Lenaug, had been the victims of a slow invasion, one disguised as a cry for help and pleas for sanctuary. Washington's forefathers had posed as the frail meek of the earth nearly some 167 years prior when they first arrived in Sagadahoc, Abenaki region, though they turned out to be ravenous wolverines. Near exactly 100 years earlier, Richard Waldron had used a flag of truce to goat over 400 Wabanaki soldiers into slavery. Should he trust him? The question remained unanswered. Later, they had captured and caged Paul Laurent, training him into sicking the boy on his own people. The Europeans had been abducting people into one form of slavery or another, since long before they had a foothold on our continent. It was starting to seem as though even the Chenoo myths of old might have been describing their monstrous ancestors, and yet the question still rung out from the core of his mind. Should he trust him? Suddenly, the question shifted ever so slightly. As he thought back to all the leaders that preceded him, the intelligently optimistic Sacmao Anadabiju, the mindful Sacmao Maupeltuk, the mercantile Sacmao Mesamutuk, the diplomatic Sacmao Panonatuk, the wind's whisper of death, Sacmao Wawanolewat, and the keenly phenomenal Captain Kobit. After all they had lost, whole armies sold into slavery, the Deer Island concentration camp and the peopling of Barbados, the burnt church abomination, the day Chiniskam cried, and just recently the Great Expulsion. After all that we as a people had lost, the real question was, had Denaquara had any other choice but to trust him? Maybe it was the dampness of his aligu, soiled from the trek in the rains from his hometown of Pisiquid in the heart of Enmigtakamug, the bed of Glooskap during the travel to Pig's Gusset, which the invaders had translated to Watertown, but whatever it was, Sacmao Denaquara certainly felt the weight of the situation. All the other Sacmac would follow suit. While today it may be hard to imagine why the Lenaug supported the British mutineers during the British insurrection in America, when put into context, it begins to make a lot of tactical sense. To date, the Lenaug had been repelling the most sadistic military force humanity had ever produced for exactly 100 years. This our ancestors accomplished while braving the terrorism of slave abduction during supposed peace times. Repeatedly, we became victimized by our own ethical optimism. This relentless assault, coupled with German Hessian mercenaries, was compounded by the stress of withdrawn support by French cowards and worse French traitors, many of whom literally traded their full-blood families and former Lenaug allies for slave sale profits. This was all while scalping bounties, and the proclamation of Cornwallis in 1749 had turned every European in the lands into a lethal threat. To make matters worse now, their numbers had grown. The days of mass refuge, invasion, and sporadic declarations of peace had turned Lenumtgi's most populous cities like Pijinuiskak, Louispoulk, and Kipuktuk into integrated societies ruled by the immigrants. All this we Lenaug might have thwarted had it not been for Laurent and the other sellout Sacmac, who in the 1760 edition of the Treaty of Peace and Friendship pledged allegiance to their new foreign king an ocean away. This act conducted, had relegated Lenape absolutists to a marginal fracture, a scattered remnant of a nation no longer positioned to direct our own affairs in our own country. Now here was one more promise which, if true, could restore all that. Not the lives, but the lands and the opportunity to build again. At best, and at worst, Washington offered to repel a common enemy. Though he might certainly turn out to be an enemy himself eventually, for now he was the enemy of my enemy. And that was enough in this desperate moment to sign the lives of 600 brave Lenape Smaknisk into Washington's charge for 3 years. It was a disaster, a convoluted concoction of mishaps and misfires that ultimately resulted in the slow piece-by-piece disintegration of the Lenape's final 600 Smaknisk. This Lug 600 were the final formidable fighting force the nation could muster, and they had been wasted on the efforts of George Washington's aims. In the Clause 9 of the Watertown Treaty, the new United States had committed to storing ammunition and other supplies in specific hidden drop points called tuckmasters. On the rare occasion that these tuckmasters were actually reached, they were found empty, as Washington failed to ever equip any of them with any of the essential supplies that the Lenape would have desperately required. Clause 7's provisions and vessels, which were supposed to meet the 600 in Machias and Akina, would leave the Lenape 600 exhausted after a grueling trek from throughout Lenape. The men weren't intended to arrive all at the same time, thus they were easily scattered among the forestry and unassembled. This ultimately was where the British forces caught up with them, barely armed and unable to mount a coordinated defense. The British picked them off as small groups arriving for departure to the city of Shomut, which the English were calling Boston. However, this was not certain death for the Lenape 600. British policy of the day had been shipping indigenous prisoners of war to either Barbados, Jamaica, or Bermuda since 1622. That's a full century and 55 more years of indigenous enslavement shipping to these 3 islands. It was so much, in fact, that by 1675, Bermuda had passed a law prohibiting it. On the 14th of June, 1676, during Pometacom's War, the Assembly of Barbados passed an act following suit, effectively yelling, "No more indigenous slaves, we're full." They too prohibited the importation of Niji, or so-called Indians, onto the island. By now, in the first seasons of the Niji apocalypse, otherwise referred to as the Revolutionary War, prisoners of war were only legally being marooned on the island of Jamaica. It was the year 1777, and the British were still dealing with the revolutionist-like measly rebels. Thus they created a new charge of high treason in America, which landed all caught in the penal colony of Jamaica. Of course, since the rebels were primarily enlisting the help of indigenous Niji, these were being charged with treason. Having fought for Washington's blue coat, rebels caused these marooned Lenape men to be generalized by the term black, like so many before them, and so many more after. Upon arrival, the marooned were stripped of their indigenous ethnicity and solely referred to by their given racial moniker of blacks. The matter of the treaty rights of the Colley Wentworth lineage and allied descendants of Preston Township. Clause 4, Section 4, affirms the acknowledgement of their indigenous identity with this statement. Constitutional law, Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. The Maroon treaties qualify as such rights.